over here. Let's move over here. Here we go. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Having a good time? Yeah? Cool.
Full house today.
Full house.
Where is the fire?
Where is the fire? I don't know. Nobody light a match. This place is whole wood. So everybody, we wanted to have a quick chat with one of the key VCs in Europe, and we'll also be having another VC panel later on. And obviously, VCs and investors and angels are part of the ecosystem across Europe and globally. And one of the very interesting ones that's been going around, and one of the oldest ones in the space, has been Index Ventures. I mean, let's hear it for Giuseppe Zocco here, everybody. Thank you very much for coming in. Giuseppe, now it's actually not very well known the Index has an Italian partner. But in fact, you've got 3 Italian partners, right?
We do, and actually one is heading our biotech practice, Francesco De Robertis, and one is now in the San Francisco office, Mike Volpi, who was born in Milan and then grew up in Japan and the US. But you know, there are definitely 3 Italian passport holders, let's say. We're 12 partners now. When we started, we obviously a smaller group. We were 4 partners and a couple of assistants. So it was really a startup mode that got us going. We were based initially in Geneva in '96. And the idea was really to take the California model to Europe, all of Europe, including obviously Italy and any other maybe more less developed areas in terms of startup at the time, certainly. And on purpose, we didn't want to be in London, which was the most active part, because we believe that continental Europe in all these regions, including Eastern Europe, would be an interesting area.
What would you describe as the Californian method of investing?
It's something that we actually have all experienced firsthand, because we've all lived in the Valley for a few years. I did my MBA there, and then I studied there. After studies, I worked there for a year. And most of my partners do the same. And the idea is really to be intimately linked to your companies and to be a partner, not just a financial partner, but try to help them open doors and develop a network that may be relevant to them, whether it's industrial network for collaborations, whether it's a recruiting network to help them recruit the right people, and become personally invested in companies that we like to support, and ideally do that over the full spectrum. So over time, we've always started to focus our investment on early stage, and over time, we've expanded the platform. Now we go from seed stage, which is literally the 2 guys in the garage with nothing else and a couple of ideas.
That's Index Seed, right?
That's Index Seed, that particularly my partner Sol and Robin and a number of others that you know well are focusing quite a bit of attention on, and that's now a dedicated team. We do about 30 of those investments a year. Then we have Index Ventures 6, our 6th fund, which does anything from a few million to start a company to 10, 12 million to really help them with Series A, Series B. And then 5 years ago, we launched Index Growth, which is a fund developed with the idea of really helping companies that are already successful. They already have their 20, 30 million in sales to go to the few hundred in sales, and to do what the American companies always had the opportunity to do, which was have a long runway to build some significant businesses rather than having to either sell too early or be limited in resources and therefore limiting their ambition level. So now we have everything from seed to growth.
You were one of the sort of trailblazers in bringing the sort of Californian model to Europe. But now we are seeing a new wave of investment vehicles such as Passion Capital in London, 500 startups, Y Combinator in Silicon Valley, and a couple of new ones developing in the UK, for instance. What do you think has changed in VC investing over the last couple of years? Do you feel like you used to be the young guys and now you're part of the old guys now, or do you think there's a new wave coming on? What do you think?
I think there is definitely a
certainly
new
the
wave.
trend more towards smaller funds as well.
There is, and there is, I think, a renewed interest in seed. For example, we have helped launch and are a big supporter of Seed Camp that one of my partners, Sol Klein, and a number of other interested parties, angels, and other entrepreneurs are helping develop. And that's really devoted to helping very, very early stage business plans to be formed, teams to be assembled, really a seed activity, much like the Y Combinator in the US. There is the White Bear, in London there's a lot of activity, in Berlin there's a lot of activity. But also, I think in many other parts of Europe, this is pretty unique in Europe. You don't have the Silicon Valley and Route 128 in Boston. You have a number of areas that can really nurture startups. And so you have to be organized to overview and be able to help people wherever they are, not just if they're in London or Berlin.
What do you think are the problems that we've got to solve in Europe in terms of investment? I mean, a lot of the newer funds now are raising from family offices. Their limited partners are, family offices or high net worth individuals. There seems to be a lot of money locked up in Europe that needs to be unlocked and put into innovation. How do you think we can unlock it?
Really, it's not a question so much of capital. There is a lot of funds available for early stage companies, and now not only our fund, but other funds help companies go later in stage. So there's much more availability and there's much more specialization than 10 or 15 years ago. So if you're a VC with a certain industry focus, we, for example, have biotech, internet software, you can actually, as an entrepreneur, direct your interest to a specific source of capital. So I think that part is quite well done. The problem, I think, has been really exits and creation of significant enough companies to bring the overall industry above a certain level of general returns to attract a lot of public investors and other type of investors to follow European companies. Now, there are obviously, in the latest generation especially, quite a lot of very, very significant European companies, venture-backed companies. For example, in our latest review, we have about 20 companies that are very, very known and combined sales of 1.3 billion euro. They've created 5,000 jobs in the last 7 years. And some of those are companies that are well above 100 million. For example, Ozone, which is the Amazon of Russia. For example, Privalia, which is pretty well known in Milan, but obviously is a Spanish company, number one in that particularly flash sales model in Italy, Spain, and Brazil. For example, Photobox, which is the Vistaprint of Europe. For example, LoveFilm. There are a number of these companies that now are getting to a stage where they're not only well recognized and well established, but can actually create good, strong public company in the near future.
Do you think that there's a lack of exit opportunities in Europe? For instance, in the UK recently, they've started the process of maybe creating a new market. You guys have been quite involved in that.
We've been quite involved in that, yes.
A new sort of, mini NASDAQ or something in London on the London Stock Exchange. I mean, for instance, do you think there's opportunities for Italian startups here to float on the Italian Stock Exchange? Enough opportunity?
So those are two related things, but certainly it's very important for a European company, if they can, to have a European stock exchange. Its proximity is interested, they could be local champions. There have been some good examples. Yuk is a very good example. Yuk's in Milan and obviously recognized in London. Betfair, we were not investors in Yuk's, although it's a company that we would have liked to be associated with over time.
Did you miss out on Yuk's?
Betfair, of course, is one of our companies. There are a number of those that have, despite the regulation, been able to go public. But now with this idea of lowering, the capital requirements to 10%, we were quite involved in that as Index. We think it's good for the industry. As you know, we're investors in Moleskine, which is right now in the process of preparing an IPO. That will be targeted at the Milan exchange, which is obviously linked to London. But those are exceptions. We also have European companies that had to go to the US. Because of the lack of IPO market. So it'll be important, I think, also for regulators, policymakers, and whoever in the audience might be interested in facilitating that process to recognize that it'll be advantageous for European innovation to have a European IPO market open to tech companies.
What about the issue to do with, for instance, and you guys roam all over Europe. I mean, I think that a lot of the times I speak to VCs or people in European cities like Paris or Berlin, and they say, why don't a VC have an office here, etc. Well, most of the time you guys are on planes anyway, so what's the point in having an office? But do you guys have an office in Rome or in Milan?
We have actually 4 offices. London, which is the largest, Geneva, San Francisco, and then a back office in Jersey. And we really believe in covering Europe from central bases. We don't believe in the multi-local approach. And we've invested in Spain, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, in all variety of regions that might be considered periphery to London and Berlin. Obviously, we're very active in London and Berlin as well. We're also active in the US. So really the thinking, and from the entrepreneur point of view, this should be, I think, also well understood. It doesn't really matter where you are. It's your ambition level, it's your business plan, it's the team you can put together, and then you will find the capital, you will find the support, and you can reach out to funds that are in London or even in the US. And that is, I think, what maybe, in my 15 years of observing the industry, I've seen is a big difference between some of the US startups and some of the European ones. Is the ambition level, is the speed with which they believe they can become significant and maintain their leadership in the category. Our industry is all about category leaders. When you develop a new category, you can be a follower and participate in something successful, but if you're the leader, you usually capture 70 to 80% of the value in that new category. So it's important to build and maintain leadership, and that has to do with speed and scale.
A lot of the time I see one of the differences between US investors and European investors is that the European investor will often talk about how do you create a business model in the next couple of years for this startup, whereas the US investor talks about how do you get to 10 million users, how do you get that critical mass of users, and how do you create a structural monopoly in 5 years or something like that. I mean, this is two different kind of approaches.
Yeah, to some extent, although I think most people, particularly in the after bubble reflection and then after the 2008, have understood that it's very important to have a resilient business model. And I think the latest developments, in the group on the Zyngas and all this sort of very publicly known situations have reinforced that idea that you do have different ways to get to scale. Some of them are more expensive, some of them are less expensive, but ultimately, pretty quickly, you have to end up into a profitable business model. And we have been, for example, very active in the fashion industry. We've invested in companies like ASOS, which is very large, Net-a-Porter, Nastigal. All the best companies in those spaces have been created with very little capital. ASOS was a couple of £1 million, Nastigal was a couple of £1 million too, often self-funded. And that has forced those companies to find a successful business model early on, which then helped them scale very, very rapidly with little capital. So, the Zalando approach, which is still to be proven, where you pour, tens of millions a year into a new initiative, might prove at some point to have some benefits if you can really defend at scale, but it's certainly something new and untested. The old way of creating a good model, scale it up, and be profitable is still very valuable.
I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions in a moment. If you have any, if you stick up your hand, I'll try and find you. It's a bit hard to see everything. But if you have any questions, let me know, and we can put those to Giuseppe. But what do you think is some of the structural issues we need to solve right now? Where do you see the gaps? Are you concerned about product or entrepreneurs? I mean, what can these guys do to really supercharge their ecosystem right now? Is it education at the early stage about getting into schools and getting young people coding and developing, or is it getting more experienced players into the marketplace, attracting executives over from bigger corporates into the startup world? What do you think?
I think it's a little bit across the board, but the key points for me, particularly in the European context, are helping universities' research and innovation get into industrialized or commercialized companies. And so have that sort of tech transfer. 15 years ago, we brought the head of the technology transfer office from Stanford to EPFL, which is an institute in Lausanne, and a couple of other universities. Imperial College in London is doing quite well. It's still the rare case where good innovation, good science doesn't get translated, particularly in biotech, but also in IT, into good companies quickly enough. So that's one area where I think, particularly in terms of policy making, as well as students being entrepreneurial, that's an area, the universities, where more could be done, the campus innovation. On the other side, the executives coming into startups is becoming more and more accepted. I think particularly with the crisis in 2008, a lot of safe jobs became suddenly unsafe, and a lot of stable companies became unstable. And I think a lot of innovative companies don't have much more risk than the large established ones. And so we're seeing now that this is easier to attract key executive talent into startups. And that's obviously one of the key issues, because Europe has always had actually quite a lot of good early entrepreneurs, but very often when the company had to scale, they couldn't find the executive partners that would reinforce the team. And that, I think, is fundamentally changed now.
Do you think there's an opportunity therefore in the global economic problems that the world is experiencing right now to get people, thinking more, taking, well, I mean, maybe not risk is probably not quite the right word, but certainly seeing the opportunities outside of corporates?
Oh, absolutely, and I think it's part is mentality, which I think has changed, and with more successful role models like Ricardo that we'll see later, and a number of the European companies that have succeeded in will foster that innovation feeling and that ambition. But also part of it is just being able to find the right partners, not only in the investment side, but also on the industrial side, to help your company grow rapidly. And I think today there is a vastly better environment than there was 15 years ago for European companies, whether they are in Rome, in Barcelona, in Moscow, or St. Petersburg, which clearly are on the map of many investors and many organizations. From our point of view, what we have done in the last couple of years, for example, now we have a dedicated function within our team for services to our portfolio companies that help with recruiting, help the companies go abroad, and from wherever they are, have the same access to headhunters or recruiters as they might have if they were in London or in Silicon Valley.
I'm seeing a lack of hands go up for questions right now, unless there's anyone. I think there's two actually. So we'll try and see if we can do a question here. Do you want to just shout it out, and I'll repeat the question. Go ahead. Yeah, go for it. Yeah. So what's the question, though? Right. So, yeah, in a second. What about, so exit opportunities? Ukes was an exit opportunity, obviously, but what other exit opportunities are there for startups coming out of Europe right now?
I think I heard the question was why Italian companies don't have bigger exits in general.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that the reality is that, if there is a company with the right ambition level and the right business, they would be quoted wherever, whether it's London or the US. There has been a very, very difficult period in the last 3 or 4 years for all of Europe. The IPOs have been very, very few, and with very few exceptions, they count on one hand, you had companies above $1 billion. I think the trend, though, is a little bit changing, because there are now a few tenths of companies that have businesses that could be worth north of $1 billion. And just to quote some that are not our companies, companies like Wonga, companies like Rovio, the Angry Bird company, companies like Big Point Software, those are companies that have clearly created a business which is very valuable. And then their choice so far has been almost by default, go to the US, right? Go to NASDAQ. So part of the efforts that Mike was talking about is to, and we've been involved, other people have been involved, is try to make the environment in London more welcoming of these businesses. Because whether they're in Italy or in Spain or in London, they will all decide fairly neutrally where to list for the best interest of shareholders. Now we have, personally, I'm on the board of 4 companies that are going public, and we always have the same thing. There's Goldman, there's Morgan Stanley, there's JP Morgan. They tell you European listing, US listing, and you have pros for Europe like this and 15 pros for US, cons the opposite, and they almost by default steer you towards a more liquid market, slightly higher price. By the way, price is not the key necessarily, but better following with investors, better analysts, all the other bit of it. So changing, and if the policymakers are listening to this, is probably an encouragement to implement the change rather quickly, because the US is only getting better. They've issued this law called the Jobs Act, where now actually, as an emerging European company, you have an increased advantage to go public in the US. So we have a lot to do, and I hope we can do, because London and Milan and Barcelona are great opportunities.
I think it would be great to see European companies IPO in Europe. I think there was a question over there. Do you want to shout it out as loud as you can? When is the right time to seek investment from an angel or from a VC as opposed to, going for revenues and making profit, etc.? What do you think?
So as I was starting to share before, as early as possible. When you have an idea and you have 2 persons in a garage, that's, our seed fund, for example, has done about 29 of those investments last year. This would be maybe 100,000, 200,000 euros. It's not a huge amount, but it helps you build a relationship with an investor, and other funds have similar activity. But we certainly see that as a way to build a relationship with your investors. The second phase would be a proper Series A venture round, maybe 2 to 5 million euro to get you up and running, and that could be clearly pre-revenue, pre-profitability, pre-product oftentimes. And then what I was talking about is the opportunity now for companies who have been successful building a $20, $30 million business. They may need another 30, 40 million euros to really expand. And rather than have the small exit that the gentleman before was talking about, rather than going public at 200 million, they may actually wait to stay private for a longer time. And that's why our growth fund, for example, is investing in companies that on average have 45 million euro in sales. They grew 73% last year. So these companies are still on a very steep growth, but they're very sizable. And they could go public or be sold today, but they've chosen to stay with their project for another 3 to 5 years to become bigger. So really today, I think for European entrepreneurs, there's sort of no excuses. You can go seed, even if you have a bootstrap company that makes 20, 30 million, you can still bring it to the next level. If you're somewhere in between, you can get Series A. It's up to you.
But an investor is always going to say invest, take investment as soon as possible, right?
Well, it depends, because sometimes you're not ready for the big round, or you're not ready for too much capital, and the company could be detrimental. So that's why I think it's important to select your partner depending on the stage. If you have a good idea and you're not sure, you go talk to a seed capital. Angels are also helpful, or if you're even before that stage, sign up for seed camp.
Maybe it's a little bit like having a relationship. You go out a few times and then maybe eventually you have sex. Now, we're out of time, but thank you very much for your questions. But I'm going to get one commitment from you before you leave the stage. I checked out that you actually have a Twitter account, GP Zocco, correct?
I do.
And you have tweeted only 3 times in 2011. So let's get the VCs tweeting and getting more of a relationship with entrepreneurs on Twitter, maybe.
Actually, the 4th time was this morning before coming here.
The 4th time was this morning. Right, I want to see you tweeting a lot more, Giuseppe. Thank you very much, Giuseppe Zocco from Index. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. See you later.